Okay, now let's talk a bit about the history of neuroscience as a field. So, if we go all the way back to ancient Egypt, the very first recorded written reference to the brain shows up in hieroglyphs. Actually, it's this papyrus over here discovered by Edwin Smith, so it comes from about 1700 BCE, and it's actually physician's notes of a patient who had suffered some sort of head injury and had trouble moving or had some sort of motor impairment. So we know at least this far back there is a recognition that the brain is somehow involved in movement and sensation. But the idea that the brain actually is involved in anything like consciousness or personality is not yet does not exist. So in fact the heart is seen by most civilizations, at least that we know of at this time, as the seat of consciousness or the seat of the soul or whatever you want to call it. And that continues well into the at least in Europe in the ancient Greek area. Not by everybody. So in fact, Hippocrates, who you may have heard of, he's a pretty big deal. If you go to medical school, you'll take the Hippocratic Oath, and it's named after this guy. So he was a physician in ancient Greece, and he did recognize that the brain really is the seat of intelligence and of the mind, but that was not universal. In fact, most prominent philosophers and naturalists, like Aristotle, for example, still considered the heart as the seat of human intelligence and consciousness. The brain, Aristotle, for example, no one really knew what the brain did, and Aristotle's idea was that the brain, its job was to help cool down the blood. So he and a lot of other Greek philosophers, naturalists at the time, believed that the temperature of one's blood is what determined, in part, your emotional state. So, in fact, that's where we get terms like hot-blooded and cold-blooded. So if you're hot-blooded, you're easily angered or excitable, and someone who's cold-blooded is calculating and very calm. And that's where those terms come from. And so Aristotle, in fact, thought that the blood from the body would enter the brain, and then that would help cool it down. And in a way, of course, we can laugh about stuff like that now, but in a way that makes sense when you think about the heart and the brain. If you don't know anything about the brain, you just looked at it, it's just this big, motionless, mushy lump that's inside the skull. And yes, it's important. Obviously, it's connected to every other part of your body, but it doesn't do anything. It's not dynamic. It just sits there. Whereas an organ like the heart, it is a pump. It's constantly moving. It's pushing blood around, and it's at the center of the body. It's connected to the rest of the body by the blood vessels. It has again, a lot of moving parts. It's very simple, relatively. So there's just the four chambers, and you can tell the direction the blood goes. Also, the heart, as everyone knows, is connected at least to emotion, because if you're excited or scared or experiencing other strong emotions, your heart rate might increase. And so that's probably where that idea came from, that the heart is where human intelligence and emotion live. And in fact, we still have those ideas with us today to some extent. So whenever someone talks about, I know something in my heart, or my heart tells me this, that's again where those ideas come from. But again, in this time period, that they literally believed that is what the heart was doing, or what was going on in the heart. And now, mostly when we say that, it would mean it as a metaphor. And then those ideas from ancient Greece, especially Aristotle, really predominated, again, at least in Western Europe, all the way through, including the Roman Empire. So you have in the Roman Empire people studying the brain in more detail. So people like Galen. Galen's kind of, again, one of those sort of considered fathers of medicine, and he studied the brain, but he believed that the brain did control the body and could receive signals from the body, but mostly through these fluids that ran through it. So if you cut open a brain, this over here is actually a sheep's brain, and if you cut open any brain, you will find these empty cavities that we call ventricles. Now, we'll learn about the ventricles later, but mostly they're just filled with clear fluid, kind of, again, like the heart, but unlike the heart, the ventricles don't, the fluid in the ventricles isn't pumped around. But Galen and other anatomists believed that this, in fact, this fluid was how the brain communicated with the rest of the body, because of course the brain is also connected to nerves, and the nerves go out into the body. So the belief was that the fluid in the brain was sort of pumped or squeezed through the nerves, which were actually little teeny tiny tubes, and that's how signals went to and from the brain and the body. And this fit with other ideas about the body and health at the time. There was this belief that there were these vital fluids, or what are called humors, that flowed throughout the body, and it was effects on those fluids or those humors that caused disease and affected emotion and personality and all that stuff. So these ideas from the Greek and Roman Empire, again, especially Aristotle, lasted for a long, long time. So at least in Europe, well into the what we call the Renaissance now. So after the fall of the Roman Empire and on into the 1500s, to some extent, is what we sometimes call the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. You'll learn all of this in Western Civ if you haven't already. And but then in the Renaissance, you have sort of new views about the body and the brain that start to appear. So, for example, there are people that study the body in much more detail. Andreas Vesalius was a famous anatomist, and he studied the brain and the body in great detail, and was also a great artist. So if you ever look up Vesalius on Google, you'll find all kinds of really intricate anatomical drawings. This is a picture he drew of a head that he had cut through the skull and to expose the brain, and had labeled it. And he did a lot of these sort of very Gothic, very intricate drawings that were not only anatomically correct, but were very highly detailed and in fact very artistic. And that was new because, in fact, if you go back to Galen and other Roman and Greek anatomists, they studied the organs and tissues of the body, but really, for the most part, they studied animal organs. There was a taboo against studying human bodies, even in death. And so most of what we learned, or what Galen and other anatomists in the Greek and Roman Empire learned, was from studying the brain and other body parts of animals. But Vesalius and other Renaissance era anatomists started to actually study the human body, and so for his subjects were all people that had died, mostly prisoners that had been executed. But still, he had learned a lot more about actual human anatomy. However, there was still not really much more insight into how the brain worked or how it interacted with the body. Another technological advance in and around the Renaissance was the hydraulic pump. So if you don't know how a hydraulic pump works, it basically uses the movement of fluid to control levers and gears. And the inference was made at the time that the brain controlled the body the same way. Because again, if you cut open the brain, all you see is this mushy gray tissue surrounding these empty cavities that are filled with clear fluid. So one idea at the time was that the brain essentially pushed this fluid around the body through the nerves. Again, they acted like little tubes, and they would push the body around by hydraulic force. So, for example, if you and again, this was based on observation. So, if you flex your muscles like your biceps, they kind of bulge out. Now, of course, now we know that that's because of the way that muscle proteins slide against each other. But the belief at the time that it was hydraulic fluid from the brain that was pushing into the muscles, causing them to swell, and as they swelled, laterally, they contracted longitudinally, and that's what caused movement of the muscles. And so again, now we know that's not true, but that was the belief at the time. This guy, Rene Descartes, was, again, one of the proponents of this idea of the brain as a hydraulic pump. He also, and again, this idea, the idea of the heart being the center of intelligence or consciousness, was starting to go away. Now the brain really was seen as the seat of all important sensation and control of behavior with the body. But the idea that the brain by itself could explain all of human experience was not very popular, and so people like Descartes proposed that the brain itself, the physical organ, all it really does is control the body and process sensory signals from the sensory organs, but that was it. All the higher level activities of the so-called mind, consciousness, emotion, intelligence, that was carried out by a completely separate entity. Again, you could call it the mind, you could call it the soul, but it was a non-physical structure or a spiritual or otherwise ephemeral thing that interacted with the brain, maybe even resided in or near the brain, but was separate from the brain. In fact, Descartes himself believed that the mind or the soul resided inside what's called the pineal gland, which is a little tiny pea-shaped gland way at the back of the brain. And his idea was that that's where the mind was, and it interacted with the rest of the brain and therefore the rest of the body, again through the movement of these fluids. Now, of course, we know a lot more about how the brain works, and it does not, in fact, it's not controlled by the pineal gland. The pineal gland is important, but it's not the seat of intelligence. But these ideas, again, a lot of them are still with us. So this idea of mind-brain duality, the idea that the brain is simply a physical organ and it controls some aspects of mental function, but really the important part, so-called the higher level aspects like consciousness, somehow are separate or are inexplicable by just the physical processes going on in the brain. Now, the modern scientific consensus is, of course, that everything the mind does is explained and, in fact, really exists within the brain. And that's, we'll learn more about that as we go along. But again, some of these ideas you'll still hear about in various circles. Fast forward a bit more, now we're into the 1700s. Again, more and more detail about the brain and the nervous system being discovered. The brain itself is analyzed in more detail. Better preservation methods allow for studying the brain in greater detail. Also, better techniques of dissection, just looking at the brain intact more often. So you have, for example, the notion that the brain itself has two types of tissue in it, a darker layer of tissue called gray matter, and then a lighter area called white matter. Some anatomists and people who studied the nervous system recognize that the gray matter really is the place in the brain where information storage and processing occur, and white matter is more important for connection. So connections, communication between gray matter areas was where white matter was what happened in white matter. And later on, we'll learn why that is. So in fact, white matter consists mostly of fibers called axons that are ways for neurons, the cells of the brain, to communicate with each other. And then this idea that the ventricles somehow were the important part of the brain, the part that sent information around the body, that starts to fall away here in the 1700s. The idea that the brain and the spinal cord and the rest of the nervous system are actually two separate systems starts to be recognized during the 1700s. So now we recognize that the brain and the spinal cord really are two parts of one organ system called the central nervous system. and then all the nerves and ganglia in the body that connect to the brain and spinal cord. Those together we refer to as the peripheral nervous system, and we'll learn about those differences later, but we'll also learn that they are actually not just physically separated from each other, but they actually develop separately, so they really are distinct organ systems. Also in the brain itself, the idea that different parts of the brain may have different functions, more anatomical detail, especially of the cerebrum, the outermost part of the brain, starts to be worked out. So if you look on the surface of the brain, you'll see all these little bumps and grooves. The bumps we call gyri, the grooves we call sulci. And those bumps and grooves are compared across different brains of different people, and again, also in animals. And some landmarks are discovered. So that's how we end up with the different lobes. Each part of the cerebrum, at least the cerebral cortex, the wrinkly part on the outside, different lobes are identified. So you have the frontal lobe, which of course is where it sounds like in the front, the occipital lobe all the way at the back, the temporal lobes on the side, we talked about those earlier, and then the parietal lobe kind of in the middle. These lobes actually are named after the bones of the skull they sit under. So the frontal lobe is under the frontal bone, parietal lobe is under the parietal bone, occipital lobe under the occipital bone of the skull, and so on. And then the idea, again, that these different regions may have different functions becomes a new idea. And then nerves also, their role as connections with the body becomes more and more important. The other thing, another thing that's discovered around this time in the 1700s is electricity. So this is when you have Ben Franklin and his kite experiments happening. And now that we've discovered electricity, the notion that maybe the brain and the nervous system communicates with the body by electricity starts to become popular. And in fact, that's because some scientists start to study the nervous system by using electricity. So some famous scientists like Galvani noticed that when you attach an electrode to a nerve and then apply electrical current, you can cause the muscle it's attached to, this is something you would do in a dissected animal, but the muscle would twitch. And so the idea that the nerve communicates with the muscles by electrical signals again starts to become popular. And in fact, there's recognition that not only the nerves but also the brain and spinal cord are capable of generating and propagating electrical signals. Also, the nerves are recognized as containing both motor and sensory signals. So that means motor signals are signals coming from the brain or the spinal cord that control muscle and therefore generate movement. And then sensory axons or sensory nerves are those fibers that carry sensory input from, say, the skin or the eyes or the ears or whatever sensory organ back to the central nervous system. So most nerves in the body are what we call mixed nerves. That means they contain both motor and sensory axons, and so they take information from the brain to the spinal cord, and from the brain and spinal cord to the body, and from the body back to the brain and spinal cord. And so that insight also appears in this time. Fast forward some more into the 1800s, more and more detailed study of the brain going on, not just anatomical studies of dead animals and people, but of people who are alive and animals that are alive. And so new techniques for doing brain surgeries are developed in both animals and people. So for example, you have people doing what are called ablation experiments, which pretty much just means going into an animal's brain and ablating or just destroying part of it, either by cutting it out with a knife or maybe sucking it out with a little vacuum or whatever. And then looking to see after the animal recovers from the surgery, what, if any, effects there are on their ability. So for example, the cerebellum, which is this structure here at the back of the brain, was around this time recognized to be part of the movement system, or what we call the motor systems, because when that structure is removed in birds, for example, experiments showed that they could not move as well. And so that was one of the first recognitions that a particular part of the brain may have a particular function. Now, this idea that different parts of the brain do different things was probably taken to its extreme by this guy named Franz Gall. So Gall is the inventor of an idea called phrenology, and he believed that because different parts of the brain are responsible for different aspects of behavior and personality, you could tell something about a person by looking at the surface of the brain. But of course, you can't look at the surface of their brain when they're alive. So he concluded that you could use the surface of the skull essentially as a proxy. So this came from the idea that, you know, if you exercise enough, your muscles will get bigger. If you do a lot of leg exercises, then your leg muscles will grow. If you do a lot of bicep curls, your bicep muscle will grow over time. And so Gall drew the conclusion that the same thing was going on in the brain. If you use a particular part of the brain a lot, it will grow, and it led from there, according to Gall, that the surface of the skull would also grow. So he basically was proposing that you could tell things about someone's behavior and their personality by feeling the bumps on the surface of their skull, and that's what he did. He supposedly mapped out every aspect of a person's personality on the skull. This diagram is a typical example of a phrenology diagram. And he believed that you could do this. So he would go around and measure people's skulls just by feeling it with his fingers, and he would tell you all about your personality and your behavior. Now, of course, he was wrong about a lot of things. In fact, the very little of what he proposed really is true. Gall really was more of what we would now call a pseudoscientist, if we were being generous, but scam artist might be a better way to describe it, because of course he was really no better than a palm reader or an astrologer at predicting someone's behavior and personality. Also, the shape of one's skull and one's face obviously has a lot to do with one's ethnic background. So there was not a little bit of racism embedded in the ideas of phrenology as well. But he was not 100% wrong, because we now know that in fact different parts of the brain do have different functions and are related to different aspects of behavior. But it's just not that you can describe it with such fine detail as he suggested, and there's no correlation whatsoever between your skull or the shape of your skull and your personality. But one of the most famous examples of an area of the brain that does have a described function was discovered by a French neurologist by the name of Paul Broca around this time. So he discovered in some of his patients that had had brain injury or stroke that if they had an injury on the left side of the brain, almost always, in the frontal lobe, so the left frontal lobe, particularly the inferior frontal lobe, so that means down low on the left side of the front part of the brain, these patients very often would have a language deficit. So they would have trouble producing words. And oftentimes these language deficits will be in the absence of any other kind of deficit. So they could still talk, they could still, they could not talk, they could still walk, they could and move normally and seem to have normal cognitive ability. It was just their ability to produce speech. And so he proposed that this region of the brain was responsible for producing speech. And he's right. He was right. There are many other, there have been many studies since then that have shown that the left inferior frontal lobe, in most people, not all, and we'll talk about that later, that is where the sort of speech center of the brain seems to be. In fact, now we call this region, this area of the brain, Broca's area, for that, named after him. And then another famous scientist from the 1800s was Charles Darwin. Of course, Darwin is known for his theory of evolution by natural selection, and his theory says that any heritable trait that gets passed on from parent to offspring is subject to natural selection. That means that if it improves the survival, or what we call the fitness of that individual, makes it more likely they can reproduce and pass those traits on, then those traits become more and more common over time, and new traits that further improve fitness or survival become more and more common still, until after many generations you have new species being formed. And Darwin proposed that this didn't just apply to physical traits like things like hair color or fur color or body size, but they also could be applied to behavior. So behavior itself was a heritable trait, therefore subject to natural selection. And common behavioral patterns that you can see in different species can be thought of as coming from a common ancestor. So this idea that behavior is heritable and subject to natural selection reinforces the idea that it is a biological trait, and therefore can be studied just like any other biological trait. Okay, next time we will talk about kind of some of the fields that exist within modern neuroscience.